Would you open up to page 827, because you'll need to read the Pesukim with me. This week's Parsha and next week's are both really a study in leadership breakdown. And they can teach us a lot about leadership, which you can use in your roles as leaders in your home, in your roles in the workplace, in the synagogue, throughout our community here in Birmingham. So I hope you'll find something to learn. If you look there, the very first opening phrase of chapter 11, Vayihi ha'am kimit onanim ra'ah be'oznei Adonai, and the people took to complaining bitterly in the ears of the Lord. It says that term complaining is the central term that frames this first step in the breakdown of leadership. It's as if the Torah knew that complaining would play a central role in Jewish existence. I'm sure people have seen the book recently titled Born to Kvetch, right? Which means to complain, right? It's a Jewish instinct. We can imagine a better world, so why can't we get there now, right? So we raise our point, and it's incredibly important. But the other central problem of the Torah to think about is, why don't they ever get to the Promised Land? Why are they stuck for the rest of this story in the desert? Moses took them out of Egypt not to go to a desert. Took them out of Egypt to go to the Promised Land, right? They were supposed to arrive in Canaan. That was the whole deal. That was the promise. Doesn't happen. Why doesn't it happen? What we're going to read today will show a central dynamic for why it never happens. In this case here of the manna, people getting sick of the manna and saying, we have to have meat. We get right to the central dynamic that occurs between Moses and the people, and why they never get there. Where they get to a stage where complaints become the central problem. Over in verse 4, it says, the riffraff in their midst had a gluttonous craving, and the Israelites wept, and they said, if only we had meat to eat. We remember the fish that we used to eat, free even, in Egypt. The cucumbers, melons, leeks, and onions and garlic. Now our gullets are shriveled up. There's nothing at all here, nothing but this manna to look through, to look forward to. It's an extraordinary thing. Can you imagine getting sick of manna? The Midrash tells us that manna tasted like anything that you wanted it to taste like. If your thing was wafers and honey, that's what it tasted like. If you were a young child, it still tasted like mother's milk. If you were an old man, it tasted like the best steak. It tasted like what you wanted, but somehow they got sick of that. That's a stunning thing to read. Their desires for something better had outpaced the ability, apparently, of God to provide something as yummy as all that. They say, we must have meat. You kind of wonder, did anyone notice what context they were in? Is there any meat running around the desert? But Moses, we have to have meat. It's time for there to be a steak dinner in this lousy desert. But when you look at their complaint, you have to wonder, is their complaint really about the menu? Or is it that they don't actually agree about the destination that they're headed to? Is it really that the food is so bad in the desert that they begin this complaining here? Or do some of the people never really get on board with the destination? And that is beginning to come up. The text saying the rabble, right, that sort of mixed multitude, seems to indicate that it might have something to do with never having agreed to the destination. One other way to talk about it is in terms that are set forth by Ron Chaffetz. This is a wonderful book, really one of the leading thinkers in leadership studies right now, out of Harvard, wrote this book called The Practice of Adaptive Leadership. And he talks about adaptive challenges that leaders always face. Adaptive challenges are challenges to which you're never going to be able to create a quick or technical or permanent fix. You're always going to be returning to those challenges because they're socially embedded. He also says, and for socially embedded problems, think of problems like poverty. Think of problems of racism. Think of poorly functioning schools. You can't just buy something off the shelf that's going to solve these problems. If that were possible, we would have done it already. We would have created those solutions to go on the shelves. They actually exist because of how people interact because of how people behave, and that's one of the reasons they're so difficult to solve. He says something even more interesting. He says, get rid of the word dysfunction when you're talking about your organization or your institution, your business. He says there are no dysfunctional organizations. There are only organizations that work exactly how people want them to work. That kind of shifts your thinking on things, right? He says things work the way they do because there are enough people with enough power who want them to be working the way that they are working. Actually, every institution is perfectly molded to the specific and unique desires of the people who are in them. And that actually makes a lot of sense when you come to think about it, right? So what we actually then are saying when we say that we see something dysfunctional is we're saying we see something that I think could be better, right? But it doesn't necessarily take account of all the stakeholders who have made it so. Moses seems to find himself in a similar situation. Wandering around the desert for 40 years is actually what the people want to do, as we'll see in this coming week's Parsha. They don't want to go into the land. They'll have to face battles that way. It's safer to stay out here in this desert. How long do you think it took before Moses hit this stopping point? There's a clue in chapter 9, verse 11, just a couple pages back. Chapter 9, verse 5. It gives the date of the very first celebration of the Passover, at least the first mention of celebrating Passover in the Torah on page 820. And it says that they celebrated Passover in the first month. Well, they left in the first month, right? The very first Passover was in Egypt, but then they celebrated again in the desert here. This is apparently the first time. So on that logic, how long before these events? A year. It took a year before this sort of complaining about the manna started, right? When I asked people last night, how long do you think it took? Many people said, well, probably 39 years before this episode, because who would say who just left Egypt, hey, it was so good in Egypt. Man, the menu was awesome. And it was all free. Who could say that? Who remembered it, right? When you see a gap like that between the language that doesn't make any sense and what they're actually saying, that's always an indicator that there's something else that's driving things. There's some kind of gap between espoused values and actual values here. So why? Why do they break down? Why does this relationship between Moses and the people break down after just a single year? Moses, the person who's able to stand up to Pharaoh and say, let my people go. Pharaoh, the most important person in the known world. The equivalent of the President of the United States, who can launch armies just at a command. Who controls food supplies and has effects on the world all around, the entire civilization. Moses could stand up to that person and say, no, you're wrong. You have to let the slaves go free. But here, in this moment in the desert, he breaks down. Why? What hurts him that he falls on his face crying before God, not sure if he can continue? Turn back to page 828. Let's look at Moses' sadness following this complaint. Verse 10, it says, Moses heard the people weeping, every clan apart, each person at the entrance of his tent. The Lord was angry, and Moses was distressed. Then Moses said to the Lord, why have you dealt? Ill is too soft. He uses the word ra. Why have you dealt evilly with your servant? Why have I not enjoyed your favor, that you laid the burden of this entire people upon me? It's interesting to look at what Moses says. We don't get a lot of inroads into Moses' motivation or how he thinks. This is one of the best, actually, especially because he's speaking in a moment of sadness. So you get to learn what hurts Moses, which tells us a lot about somebody. He says, Lama hera'ota le'avdecha. Why have you hurt your servant? Something about this complaining with the people actually hurts Moses' own relationship with God. He thinks that God is dealing evil with him. Now, if you can break up Moses and God, then maybe this whole experiment will fail. It goes deep. Lama lo matzati chen beinecha. Why have I not found favor in your eyes? He begins to question his own relationship with God. It pushes him to a place of such self-doubt that he says, it seems you don't even like me. Because who would treat their friends this way? Giving them this kind of unbearable responsibility. Lasumit masa kol ha'am hazeh alai. that I have to carry the whole burden. This task of liberating the people has become a terrible burden for Moses. He can't do it. And you get the sense of his isolation in his very next word, He anochi, am I the one who gave birth to them? He feels alone. And then he asks the question of ownership to God. Do I have to really move this people through the whole desert? You treat me like I'm their mother, right? You leave me at home with the kids. I can't do it alone anymore. Sound familiar? That's where Moses is at after this complaining. And what breaks him down is just that drip, drip, drip of negative speech from the people. It's extraordinary to think how powerful our speech is. We often don't think about it, but rabbinic ethics does. It tells us that our speech is powerful enough to build worlds, either beautiful, good worlds we can live in, or sad ones, or even get us stuck in the desert. It's sad for me to say, but I've seen many rabbis, some of them friends, broken down in a similar way to what Moses gets to. And they're no longer leading their congregations as a result. They're there. They have a job, but it becomes just that, merely a job, not a congregation of people who are going somewhere, headed out of slavery and towards a land that God has promised us, a better place. Why? Why does that happen? Because after complaint, and you can think about this in a workspace or in your family as well, they cease to be able to remain emotionally open because it hurts too much. You hear the hurt of Moses here, right? Why have you, God, dealt evilly with me? And then that cuts him off from the source of his own strength, and so he can't keep on leading. So he stops. That happens in a lot of institutions, especially the longer the leader has been there and the more they've been hurt. It can even happen in marriages, the more that someone has been hurt. How often do you think is too often to receive a complaint from someone who you actually care about, their good opinion? Would you think once every day is too much? Once every week? Once every month? What's too much? It turns out that people have to hear, we hear from people who measure these things, 10 times more good things to displace a single bad thing, which tells you how powerful that bad thing is. I think a lot of the time when we deliver a complaint, we think, you know what, I'm not getting through. I'm going to amp this up. Maybe I'll shout a little or use really strident language. But it turns out that actually every negative thing we say already is amped up. That's why it takes so much to displace it. Well, one of the things that I want to take from this lesson, from this teaching of the Torah on the nature of leadership, is that if you're in a leadership position and facing complaints, you cannot get focused on the complaints. That's a distraction. If Ron Chaffetz is right, that adaptive challenges flow from how people are, what you need to do is continue leading people, the most complicated organisms we know. You have to continue loving on people and sharing a vision and trying to do the next right thing, as opposed to becoming closed down. But one of the key things to do is actually not to listen to what people think is the problem. Is the menu the problem in the desert? Is it really that the manna is so bad, the manna that tasted like anything that you wanted? Is that really why they're having such trouble? Or is it that some people don't like where they're going? We're left with that question sort of permanently, because the Torah doesn't answer it in black and white in terms of Parshat. But we always have to ask that question. Is the problem that's really at stake here, the thing that we're talking about, is it really this thing? It's the food? That's why we can't move on? Are you sure it's the menu? Or is there a deeper conversation to be had? Ron Chaffetz says that we have to go deeper, that we have to go beyond the ostensible problem to what's actually happening in the room. He talks about two standard ways of slowing down the direction of an organization. He says a great way to do it is to divert attention, to talk about how there's specific technical problems that have to be fixed, and to deny the nature of the problem as an adaptive, socially embedded problem, that the problem might actually involve how we think and how we act and how we relate and get work done. Or people can create a proxy fight Let's have a fight between two different personalities. That'll be more fun than talking about the real problem. That's what happens in the next chapter, right? Aaron and Miriam tell Moses that the fact that he has a wife that they don't like for very suspect reasons is really a problem, and that undermines his leadership, right? This is the very next thing that happens. It's this diverting attention from what's actually going on, or displacing responsibility, which can take the shape of scapegoating someone, they're the problem, or attacking authority, or even delegating the really difficult adaptive work to someone who's actually not in the right role to handle that form of leadership. Give it to a consultant. Let a committee handle it, or maybe a task force. And then they can't handle it, because actually we need to be having the conversation. So what can be done? First, talking about what's actually going on in the room is frequently the only way forward. And in addition, understanding that the person who you may want to be complaining to is also only human, and also probably incapable of perfection. So there will always be complaints that we could talk about, but are they the thing we need to talk about? Realize that many people are making demands on that leader, perhaps on that co-leader of your household, and so they aren't able necessarily to prioritize this one, to put you front of the line. That's because actually there is a line. There are lots of people who need their attention. Getting clear on the actual reason that people are complaining. Is it the food, or is it the destination? Will go a very long way. And that's something that each of us can do in our role as just a listener or a counterpart. When someone's complaining about something, digging a little deeper, not just taking it at face value, that of course our menu's terrible and we can rework that. That might just be wasting everyone's time. And frequently that does mean uncomfortable conversations. But what it also means is that there's the possibility of continuing to march toward a promised land, toward a different kind of existence, to experience something we have not yet experienced. Something that is different, that does involve change. It's a powerful thing that the Torah tells us that complaints can actually be the source of why an entire people gets stuck in a desert for a lifetime. And if we remember the power of positive speech to counter those complaints, to be a generator of good talk about things, it's an extraordinary encouragement. I can think of many people throughout this room who routinely bring good speech to elevate our congregation. Someone may have recently even started a secret Facebook group in order to praise good things that are going on in our community, play by play, just like a sportscaster. And you might want to join that Facebook group to know what's going on even when you can't make the events. Or other people who routinely write notes to let people know the good things that they've done and to praise them. It's an extraordinary thing that what the sages prescribe as the antidote to negative speech is affirming speech. Hakarat hatov, recognizing the good that's going on, is what can allow us to keep taking step after step towards a brighter future. I want to bless this congregation this morning, that we should be blessed to give and to receive acknowledgement of the good. That we should be blessed to, when listening to someone who has a complaint, to dig a little deeper. What's the source? What's actually going on, rather than getting stuck in the weeds? And I want to bless us that we should continue to move forward towards a promised land, a place we haven't been as a congregation, as a family, something that we can't really imagine, but that we know is out there and that we together will achieve. Shabbat Shalom. Page 176.
Yikum porkan min shemaya.
Reina bechis de v'rachem b'chayri. Marandi v'ishmaya besadchan b'kol zman v'edan, v'nomar Amen. Do we have someone to lead us in prayer for our country? Page 177. Here you are. We do alternating paragraphs. You'll do the first. We'll do that together with you. You'll do the last.
Okay. Our God and God of our ancestors, with mercy accept our prayer on behalf of our country and its government. Pour out your blessings upon this land, upon this